So today, let's take a look at how we can learn our sample libraries and our sample player and get the most out of them. And one of the best ways to teach you how to do this, I think, would be to use Indie, because Indie has some beautiful phrases, and these phrases are actual recordings of people playing their instruments in a very beautiful way, emotional way. And that's some of the most highly regarded traits that people look for in sample libraries. And so if we can replicate that in a sample library, we've really got something and have learned something. So let's see how we can kill two birds with one stone, how we can teach ourselves how to use these libraries better, and also extend our phrase libraries so that we can take one example, one phrase, and make an entire track out of it and not have it sound repetitive. So let's listen to this phrase, and I picked this phrase out of Indie because it's very emotional, very hard to replicate with normal articulation from a sample library, but it's beautiful, and if we can, it would really be something. So let's just listen to it. So a lot of emotion. The player is very good. The instrument, top quality. The hall sounds gorgeous. And it's just a beautiful line that they played. Now, how possibly could we take a sample library and reproduce or get close to that? And that's what we're going to feature on today's demo and show you how you can manipulate your samples to get the most out of them. Let's take a look. So for our demonstration today, we are going to try to replicate this phrase with the synchron player, and that will be with the solo strings because this is a solo violin performance, and we want to start matching things up as close as possible. You wouldn't want to take a solo violin performance and try to replicate it with a quartet or something like a full section of strings. So what you want to do is just match up what you can before you even start to get you in the ballpark of where you're headed. So this is also very close mic'd, so it's very intimate, close, beautiful hall. It's one violin playing, and it's connected notes, which probably will mean legato notes or articulation to start with. And it's got a lot of vibrato, almost to the point of like a tremolo, and it's just the movement in this line is quite a lot of movement and emotion. So to replicate that, we're going to have to stack a few of these articulations. We're going to need all the tricks that we have in our arsenal of different performance sliders. We're going to need some controller data lanes and 3 or 4 different articulations. But in the case of the synchron player, that's fairly simple to do, just stacking and then controlling them. So let's dig in and see how I set this up. So first I'm going to play the demonstration, and that is what you've already heard. So this is Indie on this track right up here, and that's simply set to play that one phrase one time. So the full phrase will be played, followed by my attempt at replicating that inside of the VSL synchron player, and then since that has been replicated, then you'll hear a different version, which is really the best part. If you can replicate it, it means then your preset can then play any kind of notes and have it sound like that player just began to play different notes, different musical ideas. And that's where the real power comes in as far as being able to do that. Then you can take this one phrase and make a full track out of it and not have it sound like it's just repeating one simple recording. So Let's play this, hear if I got close, and then really get into how it was done. So there's the attempt at replicating that. And for a fully exposed demonstration like this with no other tracks, I think for me it really works well. And I would be able to use the original phrase for the completely exposed parts of the song and get every bit of nuance in that, and be able to back it up with some beautiful variations that come close enough that when mixed with other tracks make this phrase so much more usable in your production. So again, now let's take a look at the nitty-gritty of how we came up with this. And one thing I should mention is, to get you there, you do have Indy's ability to pull off the notes, those MIDI notes that they used, and drag them in. And that's the first thing I did. I dragged in those original MIDI notes. And of course, those original MIDI notes by themselves aren't going to get you really close to this performance that would have so much nuance and variation and flow and changes in vibrato. And so, but these original MIDI notes do get you in the ballpark and give you a great starting place. And that's what I did. So again, having those original MIDI notes gave me a platform to start working. And it also gives you some basic velocities to go with those notes. And then I said to myself, having listened to the original phrase many times, I knew what I would need to start building this up. So with Synchron, you not only get a bunch of different examples and articulations of the samples, but you get a way to manipulate those samples and shape it, almost like putty, that you can just sculpt and shape, so that if the articulation itself isn't getting you what you want, you can use filters, legato blur, attack, release, and humanization, and a couple other things to really get you to where you need to be. And I found myself using a lot of these tools to shape this little phrase here, but was able to work quickly because after I picked the initial 3 stacked articulations that would make up the base sound for this phrase, then I just began to shape it, added some portamento on a controller, and I do have some older videos on how you can use and create your own presets. And I'm going to leave that for another video because that, there's a lot of information to know about, creating presets and custom presets. But long story short is, for this demonstration, I knew I would need that long progressive vibrato, meaning that if I unstack it here and play this one part of this 3-part articulation here, you'll hear that it starts with little vibrato and builds. So if you turn that all the way up, and I think you could hear that, but I'll play another note. You can hear that it has very little vibrato and it progressively gets more and more and more, but I needed more than more. So I had to add some, a little bit of tremolo. Because in the original phrase, just listen to it now in regards to just the vibrato and tremolo, if you can. So you can hear that bow and how it's just so expressive, and the movement, and almost to the point at the end where it's just like a tremolo on that string. And so I wanted to bring some of that and replicate that. So I did stack in a tremolo. And if I turn back on the mixing of it, you can see that under the edit, tremolo isn't turned way up, it's somewhat turned down. And sola corda was a nice articulation also in the legato category that just added a bit of a nice string to go through the middle of this. And then, of course, the progressive vibrato really is the main part of this articulation. But again, if you listen to the phrase, the beginning of the phrase is the most intricate and complex, with a little bit of almost everything. And to capture a little bit more interest there, I added a portamento, regular portamento. So I copied that and moved it here, added it to the controller switcher, so that with the controller data at the bottom here, this is where the portamento sound comes in, because I got this set up to be on a controller, and that controller is modulation CC1. Again, you can learn about all this in different videos, and YouTube has a bunch of good videos on this, but it allows you to add portamento where you want it as you play through this phrase. So that's where I just added at the beginning a little bit of portamento to come in and just sustain just a very little bit and then tail off, just to add a little more interest at the beginning. And those are the 4 articulations that I used to make up this preset. So 3 stacked together, and the stack is using the mix option. So if you click on one and you turn the blue button on, you turn on the stacking, you'll see that you get the option to mix it as a crossfade or a mix. So these are all mixed. And if you wanted to take this even further and be more accurate, you could create the tremolo just to come in stronger at the end. So you could do the same thing with another controller, where instead of having the portamento up here, you could also have a little bit of tremolo just show up at the end too on a similar type of track. So really the versatility here is endless as far as being able to shape the sound you want. But I found that I was getting close enough without getting too over involved in this. But the options are there. So another thing to mention is the expression track down here. Some more data that just makes it always moving. And I think if you ask anybody what one of the biggest keys in having your samples play better and more realistic is have them move. Just like the violinist is never standing still and is not a machine, the violin and the string and the bow are always moving. So you really want to think about how you can have your samples always moving. And so expression is a big part of that. And so this just keeps my expression slider over here always moving and being more realistic. And you can add even more realism with other things changing on the fly. You can have your attack slightly moving all the time, because maybe a machine always hits the bow with the exact same attack, but not a human being. So if you wanted to actually take this even further into realism, you could easily animate the attack moving up and down. And same with the release. The release of samples should always change. They don't play always with the same type of release, and they don't play with the same type of attack. It's all about movement, because movement makes this phrase sound so beautiful. Movement is also going to make your samples sound beautiful. And that's, again, a key part of this. So something like the synchron player, and any player that allows you to move all these different options in time easily, that's what you want to be able to do. So moving on from that, having some expression, a little bit of movement with the portamento coming in at the beginning and tailing off, having our 3 different articulations stacked and mixed. And again, if I didn't mention this, you can also mix the volume of each one of these different articulations. So the first one, progressive vibrato, is strongest. So the sola corda is midway. And the tremolo, I experimented with different things, ended up turning it down a little bit. But I think, again, if I was to redo it, I would turn it down at the beginning and just have it swell up at the end. So that's something I might do. Now, for the performance changes. So another thing you want to look for is the legato blur itself. The amount of legato a real player would change. Again, because you don't want your samples to be machine-like in any way. So even your legato blur should change, and you can vary that. And I've stated the attack. I turned down the attack a little bit because on the original phrase in Sonokinetic, I felt that the attack of these articulations were a little strong, so I kind of dulled down the attack a little bit, and that worked nicely. I lengthened the release, so the release of these samples lasted longer. And again, it'd be good to vary that a little bit and vary the attack. And also the filter. I brought the filter way down to, just because that's why they give you a filter, to change the sound of these samples to mix better with whatever you're mixing with. And that's a very handy slider. And you can also animate that. Any slider can be animated. So just being able to move an EQ, because that's basically what you're doing. You're filtering these frequencies in a way that's musical. So it gives you a big range there to mix it with. And in this case, I turned it all the way down, and I felt that really gave me a closer result to matching with the original phrase. And then humanization. Normally, this may be turned down a little bit or even higher, at maybe 15%. But I messed around with the delay and the humanization tuning until I felt that it was more lifelike. And because this phrase, being played by a human being and very emotional, it's really, you don't want anything to sound like it's perfect. And one of the great things you can do in Synchron is, because they do have very high standards in control, quality control, you can have their articulation sound very pristine and just very clean, or you can kind of make them more human and more realistic and a little bit off, with the tuning and the delay for the timing. And that helps a lot when you're trying to match it with a very realistic and human recording. So you have all that to play with. And again, these can be automated. And if you wanted to, you could add a few more sliders for even more control, as they offer all kinds of anything you could really possibly need to be able to match your sample articulation with a live recording. And then we can get into the mix, where you would say to yourself, well, we know it's an intimate, close original recording with one violin. So that's what I set up here. I turned down the volume of the reverb, and I went in and changed the actual hall IR, or the space sound of the room, to match closer with this recording. And since there are 2 different halls, I just simply went in with all the different available options. If you have a few of the VSL libraries, you end up with a lot of different options. And I ended up bringing it to more of a all around string mix, very close, and but I turned it way down. And really, between turning this up and down and deciding what type of room sound you want, where in the room you want to be, and where you want to be panned, I was quite easily able to match both the space as being close and the panning of this original recording close enough so that I was happy with that. So to sum this up, I would say that use all the tools you have available and shape it in the space. Try to match the space. Of course, you want to match the instrument and the style it's played in and the movement that's involved in the phrase. And one of the best parts is that once you do have all these settings created just the way you want, you can simply set it as a user preset. And now I have a couple presets that I can use with Sonokinetic emotional phrases. And so the next time I pull up a legato emotional phrase in Indie, and there's a lot of different ones, I have a great starting place, and we'll just have to tweak a few tweaks, and I'll be almost 90% of where I need to be. So having said that, let's finish this off with one other example of taking a phrase and matching it up and seeing the result. So let's now take a look at a different example, and this is also a complex example and what I figure would be very hard to replicate. I would say that a lot of the phrases that in the Sonokinetic libraries that are rhythm-based, quarter notes, eighth notes, 16th, and rhythmic, they're quite easy to replicate because you get the midi, and you just have to match that with a very similar articulation of a staccato string or quartet. And as long as you match the environment, the space, and the panning, and the tone, and you're pretty much good to go. But these are the very most difficult ones. They're difficult harmonically and the movement in them. So it's quite a challenge, but having really got results that I thought were useful for myself, I thought, definitely share this with people to let them know that this is not only a great learning tool for listening what makes up a beautiful musical passage, but how to replicate it is just a great way to learn how to use your samples. So let's listen to this. And that's not the right one. That is. So again, it's strings, but this time it's not just a solo violin, but there's a few other instruments in there. I believe it's a viola, and if I look here, it's so we have violins 1, 2, and the viola. So it's multiple strings, and the harmonies they're playing and the movement normally isn't very easy to replicate. But let's see what I came up with, and then we'll take a quick review of how it was done. So the first part is the original phrase, which changes this time with a chord. So from this measure here, 2 to 6, it's the original phrase with a chord change, and then it's my replicated version also with a chord change, different chord change though, just to show you how you can take that initial idea and replicate it and be able to then not only change the chord, but change the notes of the performance. And that's what we're after here. We're changing now the actual notes of the performance because the original notes were quite different. So let's listen to it again, knowing that. Just drag that down a little bit. So you get a new version, so it's very close to the original in the fact that it's the same kind of idea of strings and movement, but you're able to now change the actual MIDI notes and really come up with hundreds of, any type of variation you want. And so it was a great learning experience, first to listen to with my ears on how this performance was created. So in my mind, and then replicating that across, this time, 3 different instruments, violin 1, violin 2, and a viola, and doing basically the same thing I did with the other part of this video, shaping the legato blur. The attack was left at 0 at this case, and the release, and even the filter. And I found that humanizing still with the default here, and a big part of it was shaping the room again and changing the reverb amount. And you could also get into things like FX. So if you wanted to, if you needed to hear the pluck of the strings, the noises on the violin, the kind of very human and noises to get the most out of the VSL strings, you could actually add something like a dynamic compressor to really bring up the intimate, close details. You could compress those samples a little bit, and that would bring up some more human details. So there's a bunch of different tricks you can do to make these articulations come into line with actual recordings and make them work together. And just for one final note, let's take the original phrase, and now let's turn on the second part here. So I have another line that I've turned on, and so that is simply going to play. If I go over here and zoom up, now we have a little bit of a woodwind that's going to play on top. So and so just by not exposing everything and adding some more layers on top of your variation just makes everything begin to blend in so much nicer. So that's the theme of the video today: how to learn from actual recordings and how to use all the tools you have in your sample player and articulations to emulate those original recordings. And then in the case of Sonokinetic, you then can take one phrase and really get so much more out of that phrase because you have so many new versions you can make of it. But you can keep the original phrase recording for those completely exposed parts of your song where you want maximum use of that phrase. And use your replications to fill in the track and add interest so that it doesn't sound repetitive, and that it sounds like you actually had a violinist there, in this case, doing some recordings for you personally. And that is a very powerful prospect. Hope you enjoyed the video and had a chance to make music wherever you're at in the world today, and we'll see you on the next video.